Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Amanda, and I am DWDC's Program Coordinator. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Kelsey. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here today is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These nations continue to experience ongoing colonization and displacement. Today, Toronto is covered under Treaty Number 13 and the Williams Treaties. Dying with Dignity Canada is also mindful of broken treaties that occurred across Turtle Island and recognize our responsibilities as treaty peoples to engage in a continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all peoples across this land. So I am thrilled to welcome you today. Through our webinars, we aim to provide you with information and key takeaways, as well as create a space for conversation on end-of-life topics alongside the professionals that know it best. Before I welcome today's speakers, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Everyone on the call today is muted. However, there will be opportunities to submit your questions. To do so, please type your questions into the question bar on the Zoom side panel, and we will read it out for you at the end. In the interest of time, we ask that you try to keep your question as concise and clear as possible. Okay, and of course, while we're going to try and get to as many audience questions as possible, unfortunately, we may not get to everyone. If you have any outstanding questions or questions that are personal in nature, please email us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca and we will follow up with you. This session will be recorded, so there's no need to take notes if you don't want to. We're also going to have a post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen after the webinar to share your feedback, which also includes an application form for our Death Dialogues program. All right, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over now to Helen Long, our CEO. Helen, floor's yours.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you here. As I think you all know, the purpose of today's webinar is to talk a little bit about how you can support our advocacy efforts here at Dying with Dignity Canada. So with me today, I have Alex Muir, Sherry Moran, and Chris Jones. Alex has volunteered with us since 2017, and he is the current chair of our Metro Vancouver chapter. Alex has a really keen interest in advocacy and has participated in and led a number of our provincial activities. Sherry is a retired lawyer and federal government executive with extensive experience in policy development and legislation. Sherry is a former member of our board of directors, and she currently works with our Ottawa chapter in the advocacy group as a volunteer. And Chris is Dying with Dignity Canada's Director of Government and Stakeholder Relations. Chris has over 20 years experience in government relations, including 4 years on Parliament Hill. So he leads our internal advocacy and government relations efforts. And together, we're going to walk you through a little bit about how you as a constituent or a voter can engage with your local elected representative. And then we're going to answer some questions, a number that came in before the webinar, but also anything that you send us today. So quick overview of our agenda. We're going to talk about why advocacy is so important. We'll cover how to prepare for a meeting or a call. We'll talk about how to effectively communicate with your member of parliament. I will go over DWDC's key messages, and then we'll talk a tiny bit about what else you can do before we open the floor up for those questions. So prior to the meeting, some of you may have downloaded one of our advocacy toolkits. If you didn't, you can get it after the session, and we'll also share the links in our follow-up email. Our discussion today is really going to be focused on the issue that we hear most often from our supporters on, which is the issue of advance requests. And because that is a federal legislation issue, we'll be talking about how to speak to your member of parliament at the federal level. We will also, though, touch on how to work with either your MPP or your MLA or your provincial or territorial representative so that you can speak about other issues that might occur at the provincial level. The process is generally the same no matter the level. So as well as the toolkit for advance requests, we also have a toolkit for institutional religious obstructions, or more commonly, I think we all talk about them as forced transfers. And we also have one on mental illness as a sole underlying medical condition. So you can download any one or all of those kits. A few little things to remember. DWDC is a nonpartisan organization, so it's important to meet with people in every political party, and Chris and I both certainly have meetings with MPs across all parties. We are here to help you, so if you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to ask or follow up with us afterwards, and we can support you in getting your meeting set up. I know sometimes this can feel a little overwhelming, but I think the most important thing to remember is your MP wants to hear from you. You know, the person who lives in their riding, who votes in their riding, way more than they want to hear from any of us, you know, who work in the organization. And finally, don't feel like you have to have the answer to every question that might come up. It's perfectly fine to go to a meeting and say, you know, I don't know, let me look into that and get back to you, okay? So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, and she's going to start us off.
We'll go straight to the next slide, which is why engage elected officials, because that's what we're talking about today. Advocacy is about taking action to influence decision makers, policymakers to affect change. And you can see two very inspirational quotes on the slides here. But I'm going to add another one. Nelson Mandela always said, it always seems impossible until it's done. Well, I think we feel like that about advance requests. It seems impossible. We feel like we've been advocating to elected officials to change the law to allow for advance requests for some time. We will make it happen. Working together, we can make things happen. And one way is to influence elected officials. And for us, that's the best way. What is parliamentary advocacy? Next slide. To be a strong advocate to members of parliament or members of your provincial legislature or assembly, the best way is to establish an ongoing relationship with your elected official. You can start this with a phone call or an email or by arranging a meeting. And we'll be talking about all of those today. I'm an advocate for two nonprofits, so my MP knows when I show up at her town halls or her Zoom weekly coffee meetings that I'm there to bring her messages about MAID or about international development. I try to throw a third topic in once in a while to keep her guessing. But I know from experience that any messages that I bring to her, she passes on to her colleagues, which is great, and often to the relevant ministers. I know also that she supports us on advance requests, so I'll be breaking new ground along with some of you today by approaching my provincial member of parliament. Advocacy outcomes. Here we're really looking for a change to the law and at the federal level and a change to policies and practices at the provincial level, and you'll hear more about both of those later. But I wanted to highlight the bullet on attitudinal and belief change because I've seen it happen. On a non-MAID issue, I was part of a group that changed my MP's long-held opinion on a controversial matter. She met with us more than once, I think about 3 times, read the materials we provided, challenged us repeatedly, and in the end, she was convinced by us and became a huge supporter on a related policy resolution at the Liberal Policy Convention in June of last year. So that makes me think of the golden rules of advocacy. Be polite, be prepared, but always be persistent. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. Okay, so let's talk about preparing for a meeting. It's extremely important to do your homework. That includes finding out who your MP is and what makes them tick, reaching out, and then preparing for the meeting. So step 1 is find out who your MP is if you don't already know. And that is easily found on the government website. There's a search mechanism. You just go in and you can insert your postal code and you can find out who your MP is. And this link is included in the Advocacy Toolkit on our website. It's a bit, in terms of finding your provincial representative, different terms are used for these. So 7 provinces and all 3 territories have MLAs. Ontario has MPPs. Newfoundland and Labrador have members of the House of Assembly, and Quebec has the members of the National Assembly. So MLA is the most predominant one across the country, but there are different terms. If you don't know who your representative is, start by going to the provincial or territorial website to see if they have a search feature. In BC, they do, and it works. It's quite good because you can not only find out who your MLA is, they also have a lot of information about the MLA, their background, which is very helpful. But if you don't have that in your province or territory, the best thing to do is just Google the person's name, and then that'll start your search and finding out about the individual. So the next step is requesting a meeting with your representative. So propose a 15 or 20-minute meeting when reaching out, and make sure you provide an option to meet either in person or virtually, because they may be more amenable to a virtual meeting because it takes less time. In person is always better, but the virtual is a good backup, because it may fit their schedule better. I've met with my MLA 3 times, twice in person and once by Zoom. Remember that they're representing you, and they do want to hear different voices within the community. And so just echoing Helen's comments that it is important. It is, they do like to hear from their constituents. And as Sherry was saying, always be polite and not forceful. The intent is to let them know why the initiative is important and to provide them with information. So here is a sample email. Now, some MPs, by the way, have a meeting request template on their website, which you may be urged to use, but if not, then just send an email request. Now, in the request, it's important to let the MP know what you want to discuss and why it's important. Your approach may differ depending upon what you know about your MP. For example, if you know or suspect that your MP is not supportive of MAID, you probably don't want to go into too much detail, as it will show your hand and they may be wary, wanting to meet with you. Try to personalize your message, but here's an example which adopts a very neutral approach, so that if you don't know much about your MP's thoughts on the topic, so it doesn't really give much information. I think it actually doesn't give quite enough information. I would add to something like this, a statement like recommendation 21 of the Special Joint Committee on MAID recommended the adoption of advance requests. I'd like to understand your views on this. So what you're doing is you're just saying you want to hear their views, which of course will give you the opportunity to share yours. So that's kind of a very neutral and generic approach. I'm in the fortunate position of having both Liberal MP and an NDP MLA, both of whom support MAID, and I've communicated with them already. So I feel comfortable being direct when I ask them for support in discussing changes to MAID legislation. So here's how I would approach them. In the first sentence, tell them that you want to meet, and then provide some specific background information. So here I mentioned 3 things: the recommendation 21 from the Special Joint Committee on MAID, Quebec's Bill 11 allowing advance requests, and Bill C-390, which is currently before Parliament. Then conclude by restating that you want to meet either in person or virtually. And the benefit that I see in providing this background information is that it saves the office staff time in preparing the MP for the meeting, so that they can go directly to the sources that you've mentioned without having to do a lot of research on their own. And that means they will be more inclined to meet with you because it doesn't require a lot of work on their behalf before the meeting. If you just say advance request, then the office is forced to go back and do all this research. And so I think this actually provides provides them with better background to get ready for the meeting. And also they know exactly what you're going to be asking them. Now, in terms of familiarizing yourself with your MPP and what they stand for, once you've written the letter, or even better beforehand, I would actually do this before I write the letter, just so that you get a better understanding of what your representative stands for. then there are certain sources you can go to get information. So let's use my MP, for example. That's Jonathan Wilkinson, who's Liberal MP. And so here's what comes up on the federal government website. So if you go to the next slide, on the government website, it says you can find out he was first elected in 2015, and then it provides background information. So you find out that his current role is Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, and it also lists all his previous roles. He was Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. He was Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and so on. So that gives you a lot of good information about his role in the government. And then there's also personal websites and party websites, and they actually provide some good information as well. You can generally get more information on the person versus the party website. The party website will contain a lot of the the party positions on things, whereas the personal one will contain more personal information. Also remember that you can often sign up for updates from your MP or your MLA's office. So I'm on the list for both of them. So I get updates all the time from both my MP and my MLA. Wikipedia and LinkedIn also can tell you a lot more about the person. So what you can do is just Google the person's name, and then you'll see links to Wikipedia and LinkedIn, and it provides a lot of extra information. So here's a bunch more information about my MP. So for all this information, you find out he's a pretty smart guy with a strong focus on the environment. It doesn't tell me anything specific about his stance on MAID, but we know that he was part of the Liberal government which introduced MAID, so we can have a look at his voting record. And note that on the topic of assisted dying, the government generally allows its members to vote according to conscience. So you might have a Liberal MP who opposes MAID or a Conservative MP who supports it. So it's worth looking at their voting record. And Chris Jones can help you with this. If you just go to him, he can look back and tell you. And specifically, you could look at the voting on Bill C-14, which introduced MAID, and that vote was in November of 2015. You can look at Bill C-7 in March of 2021, which expanded MAID to include Track 2. And more recently, EdFast's private members bill, which was rejected, thankfully, which tried to eliminate access to MAID for people with mental illness. So looking back, you can actually see what their positions were on these different bills. In terms of the meeting itself, if it's your first time meeting a politician, you may want to bring someone who is more experienced to help you. And if you don't know who to ask, I'd suggest contacting your local chapter of Dying with Dignity and asking for help. And if you don't have a local chapter, then contact Chris Jones and discuss what your options are. And like, for example, a virtual meeting would be an easy way to include someone else. That's just an example, but there are other things he may be able to find someone who can go with you. When you first meet, introduce yourself. If you have a personal or a common connection, then use it. A common connection may be something you've read on the MP's website or in a recent constituent update. And I just got a recent one last week from Jonathan Wilkinson, and there was actually a very touching story about this pregnant Ukrainian woman who went to the office and got help. And so that I would use something like that to say, oh, I've read this, and it just shows that you're engaged and you're actually reading their materials. If you have a personal connection, then use that as well. And with my MLA, I've got a close friend whose son went to school with her, and they're on the same ultimate Frisbee team. And so when I first met her, I kind of used that as an introduction. And then once you've gotten past that, the introductions then explain why you are personally passionate about end-of-life rights and why it's important to you. And if you have a personal story, that's the best thing to use. And just one final point, at some point in your discussions, acknowledge that they have other commitments, especially if they're in a cabinet position, and you appreciate their time. Over to you, Sherry.
Thanks, Alex. Communicating effectively using the laser talk. This is simply a framework. EPIC. EPIC, the E is for engage your audience, P is for state the problem, I, inform about solutions, and C is your call to action. This was developed by a nonprofit in the United States, and it's used widely by a number of nonprofits. They're quite generous about sharing it. It's simply a framework to help you organize your thoughts and to communicate your message effectively. If you're lucky, you'll have 20 minutes with your elected officials, so you need to stay focused. It sounds like a long time, but once you get past the introductions at the beginning and making personal connections, the clock starts to move fairly quickly. So you really want to think ahead of time and even practice out loud about what your pitch is going to be. I've used the EPIC approach for letters to the editor, emails to politicians, and also for meetings with decision makers. It just helps keep me structured, but it's a tool, not a rule. So if you prefer a different approach to getting your message across, go for it. The important thing is to remember that people often recall the first and last things that you say in an intense discussion. And so you want to start strong by getting your listeners' attention with perhaps a first personal story, as Alex mentioned, or make sure your call to action at the end is very, very clear. Next slide, please. EPIC engage. The story here is starting with a personal fact that somebody who has had Alzheimer's with many members of their family, and so that's sort of led them to where they stand on advance requests. You can also open with a statistic. One of my current favorites is there are more than 600,000 Canadians live with dementia, of which Alzheimer's disease is the greatest cause. And researchers say this number will increase to almost 1 million by 2030. EPIC problem. This might be a good time to seek a connection with your elected representative. Do they have a family member or friend with dementia, or did they have a family member or friend with dementia, so that they better understand the context within which you want to talk about advance requests? And EPIC inform. Helen's going to be going through Dying with Dignity's positions and proposed solutions later, so I have nothing to add here. EPIC call to action. The example refers to a meeting with federal MP. If you're going to be meeting with a provincial elected official, you can ask them to indicate their support for advance requests for MAID within their party's caucus, within legislative committees, or even to the Premier or Minister of Health. Specifically, we may be asking them to ensure the provinces are readying themselves to implement advance requests for MAIDs, and also that their provincial government is getting the message across to Ottawa that it's long past time to amend the criminal code in this regard. You'll hear more on this from all three of us. Thank you. Over to Helen.
Thanks, Sherry. So in the toolkit I mentioned earlier, you can find a summary of all of these key messages, so don't feel like you have to write them down. And I should also note that this recording will be available and sent to you after the webinar is over in the next couple of days, so you can always go back and have a closer look at any of those slides that may have, gone a bit quickly for you. You may also want to consider taking a copy of the pages of key messages from the toolkit with you when you go to the meeting so that you can leave them with the MP or their assistant. So as we've noticed, MP meetings should focus on issues that are impacted by federal legislation for the most part, including advance requests. Meetings with MLAs, MPs, and all those other things Alex mentioned are provincial issues like healthcare policy. So things like forced transfers are best addressed provincially. That said, I think from time to time we will strategically ask you to talk to your provincial representatives about federal issues, but this is a good general guideline. So when meeting with politicians, the advance request definition is always a good starting point, defining what an advance request actually is. So we define it as An advance request is a written document. It involves a competent person making a request for MAID after a diagnosis of a grievous and irremediable condition, and the request could be honored later after they've lost the capacity to make medical decisions for themselves. That request would allow a person to describe in writing a future state at which they might wish to access MAID. And I think you can also provide examples of what that future state might look like. For example, you're not able to recognize your family on a regular basis, you can't feed yourself any longer, you're not able to do things that you value that make you who you are as a person, like being outside in nature, playing with your grandchildren. Our position on advance requests is that they should be a legal end-of-life option for those diagnosed with a grievous and irremediable condition leading to incapacity. So this particular position reflects that recommendation 21 in the Special Joint Committee report that Alex talked about earlier. So they've recommended specifically individuals who have a capacity limiting diagnosis like Alzheimer's or dementia. Dying with Dignity Canada believes that ultimately a more expansive definition is more appropriate. Someone could suffer a traumatic brain injury or have a stroke, something like that, but that's kind of the next step. So I think for right now, we're really focusing on the capacity limiting diagnosis. So in terms of stats, we heard from Sherry how important statistics are. We have 3 key stats that we like to use. 83% of Canadians support advance requests for individuals with a capacity diminishing diagnosis. 71% would support them for anyone who was competent at the time of the request but did not yet have a diagnosis. And 85% of those who say that they personally suffer from a degenerative neurocognitive disease like dementia support this position. And all of these stats, along with a whole bunch of others, can be found in our media center on our website, and that's from our 2024 Ipsos survey. We'll be doing some new surveying in the next little while, and once those results are available, we will also share this with you. So in terms of supporting messages, our first message was the one about the recommendation 21 that advance requests should be available. We also had a federal e-petition late last year into early this year that had over 16,000 signatures, which if you go and look at the history of the petitions that flow through the House, that's a pretty significant number. Those petitions get read out in the House, so the MP may be aware, but it's important to note that 16,000 people signed the petition. Bill 11 was introduced in Quebec. So this bill was actually passed in June of 2023, and it allows for advance requests in the province of Quebec. So when we think about that as a statement, it's important to think about the fact that Quebec is trying to lead the way, and this is going to put them out of sync with the rest of the country, something that makes it an unlevel playing field. The one thing that you should be aware of is that even though Bill 11 has passed, and even if Quebec goes ahead, as they have indicated they will, with advance requests, technically they're still illegal under the criminal code. So that brings us to Bill C-390. That is a private member's bill that was introduced in May. And that bill would allow any province with its own framework to move ahead with advance requests. So if Bill C-390 was passed, Quebec and Bill 11 would then be exempt from criminal prosecution, and they could move ahead with advance requests. Now, Sherry's going to talk a little bit about each of these pieces of legislation from an advocacy perspective.
Yeah, MAID, like most matters in our federation, has both a federal and a provincial component. So first, we need to amend the criminal code and ensure clinicians providing MAID based on an advance request are not charged and prosecuted with a crime. Could either be homicide or assisted suicide. Secondly, the provinces need to put a framework in place to implement MAID for advance requests, just as Quebec has done, because this is a really sort of complex. We've got the eligibility criteria and the safeguards in the criminal code, but the provinces need to help people with what they should put in their written request. This would ensure that all people across Canada, not just those in Quebec, with a capacity diminishing diagnosis would be able to put in place an advance request for MAID if they so choose. And at the federal level, as Helen mentioned, the tabling of Bill C-390 by a Bloc MP in May would amend the criminal code to allow clinicians to provide MAIDs based on an advance request under a provincial framework. So that involves the provinces, like Quebec has done already, to come up with a framework. You should know as well that Senator Pam Wallen introduced a private bill in the Senate over 2 years ago, and that bill would legalize advance requests for MAID, but her bill has not moved in over 2 years. So unfortunately, with these private members' bills, the likelihood of them passing is very, very slim. Nevertheless, we can use them to leverage support at both the federal and provincial levels of government. So advance requests, the Quebec approach. I'm going to start by saying the federal government has recently reiterated in letters to many of us that further consultation and study is needed before the provinces will be ready to implement advance requests. And this is the exact wording that they used in June of last year in reply to the Special Joint Committee's recommendation that we do allow advance requests for MAID where there's been a capacity diminishing diagnosis already. So in other words, it's not moving at the federal government. We're going to have to help it do so. And as Helen mentioned, Quebec passed Bill 11 last year, which added advance requests to their end-of-life legislation. And they have said they're going ahead with it, regardless of whether there's an amendment to the criminal code. And in BC, a provincial e-petition earlier this year was signed by 1,205 people requesting that the provincial government amend their Health Care Act to permit advance requests. And I know that Alex has said that BC advocates will be tackling this again in the build-up to the provincial election in October. So we can approach provincial elected officials, ask them to make sure their government is convincing the feds to please amend the criminal code and to prepare their provincial framework so that they can implement advance requests for MAID, or they can take a firm approach like Quebec, either through provincial legislation or a non-legislative framework, and just simply refusing to prosecute clinicians who provide MAID based on an advance request. That said, that's not ideal. We really need to have the criminal code amended. Thank you. Back to Alex.
Thanks, Sherry. So coming back to the meeting with your MP or MLA. So after you've made your arguments and shared any personal stories that you have, conclude your meeting with a summary statement. And there's an example given here. It's time for Parliament to take action on this humane and compassionate change and respect people's autonomy, agency, and dignity by supporting advance requests for assisted dying. And I would also add to that, though, and the specific direct action that you want your MP to take. And so, for example, I urge you to support the passing of Bill C-390. And after the meeting, with your representative, send an email or letter expressing your appreciation for the time that they've taken. It's also a great opportunity to provide any additional information which may have arisen during the meeting, including links to any survey data. So, like as a side note, I found that politicians love survey data, especially if it's recent and broken down with some demographic details. So here's a sample letter thanking the politician for their time and support. I would even add to this a reminder again, asking for their support of Bill C-390 or whatever action you're asking them to take. And don't forget to include links to any survey data discussed. So if in this note, for example, where it says recent Ipsos poll, I would send that as a link, like link that to the actual survey in the email. And it's back to you, Sherry.
What else can you do? How you can take action with your elected official? Follow them on social media and tag them when you're posting your MAID messages or messages specifically about advance requests. I follow my MP, for example, on X, formerly known as Twitter, and also on Facebook. I haven't checked to see if she has an Instagram account. Once you've met with your elected official, whether on Zoom or in person, let the world know. If in person, have a photo taken, or Zoom, you can do the Zoom wall if they agree, and post it along with whatever they've agreed to. If they've simply listened to you politely and asked questions, in other words, a good starting conversation, say that. But if they have agreed to any steps in your call to action, ask them if you can be specific about that when you post something on social media. I again experienced at the federal level, MPs are they're all over social media. It's really important to them. If you have a letter to the editor or an op-ed published, we're getting into a future webinar here, post it on your MP's timeline or send them the link by email. In other words, oh, and I should say something about in-person or virtual town halls. With 3 election campaigns coming up in 3 provinces, I think it's New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and BC, and with the federal election coming up, we don't know when, anytime over the next year, we have campaigns coming up. So not just town halls by your elected official, because a lot of them have them for various reasons, including pre-budget consultations, but those all candidates meetings. You want to go to those, and you want to bring questions about MAID and about advance requests in particular, and see what all those candidates think about it. And because that's going to be really helpful. Then you can take that information and reuse it and repost it, etc. Yeah, all of this on this chart is really about once you've reached out with a phone call, a letter, or a meeting, or all 3 of those, keep building that relationship with your elected official. It will pay in dividends on many fronts. Thank you very much.
All right, so that brings us over to questions. We've got an email address up there, advocacy@dyingwithdignity.ca. You can direct any follow-up to that email address or any questions you have as you're preparing for your meeting. But if you don't remember that email address down the road, just go on our website and reach us anywhere. There's links there to our info at mailbox, and it'll get to the right person, usually Chris, if you do that. So a couple of questions that came up during the presentation that I just want to go over quickly first. Are the letters available as templates? Yes, those are in our toolkit, so you can use those and you can adapt them as you see fit. Someone asked about a Zoom meeting. Are you required to set up the Zoom meeting? No, the MP's office will they will just do it. But certainly if they seem to think you're going to do it, you just need to say to them, could you please set up the meeting, and they'll take care of that. And then a couple people had asked about feedback or responses from their MPs. So we don't have a portal or anywhere you can share that information, but again, we're happy to get that in an email. If you just let us know what your MP said, how your meeting went, happy to get that feedback, and then talk if it's helpful about any next steps. So those were a few kind of logistical things that came up. We had a number of questions before the meeting, and I'm going to lump a couple of these together, and I think Chris is going to take a stab at a couple of these. What if your MP has already told you that he doesn't support advance requests? Is it still worth meeting? And what should I do if my MP doesn't answer my request for a meeting? So Chris, maybe those couple together?
Sure. Yeah. Well, if they indicate they're not supportive of MAID, obviously because that's to a certain extent a matter of conscience, you need to be in the first instance respectful and understanding of that. But as Sherry has pointed out, we also need to be persistent, and you may need to go to another member of that person's caucus. In other words, another Conservative MP, perhaps. So let's say it's an opposition MP. One option may be to go to the critic for that particular area, because those folks are kind of required and obligated to hear the feedback from citizens, and so you might get a more sympathetic hearing there. If it's a government MP, and your local MLA or MP is not supportive, although that's less likely in the case of the federal government, you could elevate the issue to the minister. So a minister would typically want to hear this kind of thing. One of the questions that Helen alluded to is, what if the person is not even responding to emails and letters? And you have two options. And the first would be to continue to be diplomatic, would be to go to, say, the whip's office. So that's an MP who holds a particular role in the caucus. And they're normally kind of in line, keep MPs and MLAs in line with party thinking and voting, and occasionally kind of disciplinary matters. So if you felt that you were being ignored systematically, you could just drop a note to the whip's office and say, hey, I have an issue I'd like to bring up with my MP, and he or she is not being responsive. And then the non-diplomatic way, or the more public way, if you really feel you're getting a stone wall, is you might want to write to your local newspaper, to call into a morning talk show, see if you could get onto a local TV segment, and just sort of say, hey, there's some issues in my riding, and I feel that they need a more comprehensive airing. And so an MP is always going to be super conscientious when he sees somebody in his local media. So I think those would be kind of other things to do. But I think, as Helen has pointed out, politeness, being informed, and persistence are some of the key things you want to do.
Thanks, Chris. Sherry or Alex, anything to add on that front from your experience?
No, I'm looking at some of the other questions coming up.
I just want to just comment on using the whip's office. That's what we did, Helen, if you remember, during COVID, when we had those Zoom meetings with groups of MLAs at one time, and that was coordinated through the whip's office. And I've actually approached them again I requested I asked whether they're still doing these meetings, and they said they're not going to be doing them before the election, but they've got my note. They say they'll respond to me about whether we can do something after the election to meet with groups of MLAs at one time.
Super. Yeah, that's a great way to get the message to a number of MLAs or MPs at the same time. Yeah. Okay, so question, Sherry, maybe this one for you. How do I convince officials this issue is a high priority when we compare it to others, like the environment or immigration or the wars going on?
Yeah, to me, it's right up there with climate action and addressing income inequality. How can you say that it's not a priority issue when 83% of Canadians want this to happen? And when you look at the stats as to why that's so high, it's because there's 600,000 Canadians out there with dementia at various stages of it, and that will be almost 1 million by 2030. As the baby boomers keep moving along. So it is an important issue. And I believe that the stat in the last Ipsos survey was, of those people who have a diagnosis of a capacity eroding disease, 85% of them want to be able to make an advance request. So those numbers are huge. You can't ignore them.
Exactly. Thanks, Sherry. One of the questions that's come in online, if each province can create its own legislation, so this would be hypothetically if Bill C-390 passed, yeah, will that not lead to major inequities in access across each province? So I would say the short answer is yes, that's absolutely a concern. Sherry, do you want to take a stab at expanding?
I thought that was a great question. You'll find, and probably we have some participants from Quebec. Quebec leads often on these issues, and they had an end-of-life law in place before MAID legislation came into place in 2016. So they were ahead of time. They like to do things themselves. So in addition to the MAID legislation as an exception to assisted suicide in the criminal code, theirs was set out the way they wanted it to set out. So yes, ideally, no one but Quebec would do that. They're very special, and we often follow their lead, because they lead on these issues. So that's a good thing. But I agree with the questioner. It would get confusing if everybody had their own end-of-life legislation. It's just that we're pushing everywhere we can to try and get the provinces to go to Ottawa and say, do it, like change the criminal code, because our people are saying they want us to put a law in place, and that's not really what we want. We want the criminal code amended, and we want the provinces to be ready, so the federal government can't use that as an excuse, saying that the provinces are not ready to implement it. But yes, if every province and territory had a different sort of legislative answer to this, it would be extremely confusing. People would challenge it in court, I would think, at some point. So it's not ideal. But Quebec, you go.
Thanks, Sherry. Alex, you touched on this a little bit at the end of your messaging around asking your MP to do something. Any more comment on what specific actions we can be asking MPs to take?
I think the big thing is looking like whether it's provincially or federally, just look what's within their control. And so federally, that's why we're focusing on Bill C-390, because that's something that is sitting before Parliament right now, and also encouraging them to talk to other MPs as well, because they all talk with each other. And so that's one thing that I think my MLA has been pretty good at doing, talking to other MLAs. But I think, yeah, really focusing on what's within the provincial, within their control, and talking it up with their colleagues.
Great, thank you. Okay, Chris, you touched on this a little bit, but this question gets really, I think, into the weeds. This is an attendee from Southern Alberta. Their MP and MLA are both Christian fundamentalists. They know the person well. They get a lot of success in writing letters to the editor and getting them published, but they don't have any real hope that their MP's perspective is going to change because of his personal beliefs. Any further comments on that, what people can do?
Yeah, well, I think the line you have to take essentially is that you have to provide the factual evidence and data and say, I respect your opinion, but do you realize that a great number of your constituents either have had personally or know somebody who's had a chronic illness, who's approaching end of life. You can point to, I think a gentle pushback is that we live in a secular society in theory, and that government is meant to be responsive to the public interest, and that this kind of suffering mustn't be completely ignored for ideological reasons. And I think if you kind of push back in a constructive way, I think at least you'll get some engagement with the MP. It depends how far you want to go. I mean, there are ways to move up the ladder a little bit if you feel that you would get a more responsive approach from a more senior member of the party. That's another option. So I think you just use those factual arguments at your disposal and be persistent.
Thanks, Chris. And then maybe a teeny bit of a follow-up that I feel like you've kind of addressed. But so does your message to your member of parliament need to be partially tailored to the specific political party in the riding?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it doesn't hurt to have done your homework and figure out, well, what are their formal stated positions. So as Alex mentioned, we can do a little bit of research on that about their voting record and that individual's personal statements in the past. But as a rule, I wouldn't attempt to cater too much or couch your messaging in too obviously a partisan way. I think you want to keep our reputation for integrity, objectivity, factual content very much in the fore, and see, that's your best bet. I don't think it ever makes sense to kind of complain or vociferously criticize an MP or MLA, because that will bring down the drawbridge, and you really want to maintain that engagement.
Yeah, great answer. Thanks, Chris.
So, sorry,
Go
can I
ahead,
just
Alex.
come back quickly in terms of what you can ask your MLA or your MP? Also ask them to talk to the minister in charge. So in the case of the federal, it's the Minister of Justice because it's an amendment to the criminal code. And provincially, it's the Minister of Health because we're talking about healthcare policy. And so see if they are willing to go and talk to the minister about it.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, question, Sherry, maybe you'd like to take this one. Are there any specific reasons that advanced requests are being blocked or not moving forward?
Oh, that's such a good question. Our advocacy group in Ottawa, and I'm sure across the country, other volunteers have been writing their MPs over the last year because that special joint committee in February 2023 recommended that they amend the criminal code to allow advanced requests where there's been a diagnosis. So we've been really pushing to get the government to move. I don't know. Maybe it's just that at this point in time, they still see it as very controversial. A number of people the majority of people in some of the opposition parties are very against MAID on all levels, including in advanced request would be one more step forward. So I think nobody sort of wants to fight the fight anymore after getting till C7 through, but that's just my sense that timing was not really good, but that's why we need to engage our elected officials, and the 83% of Canadians out there who support this, we need to make sure their voice is heard in some way. It's the only way that we're going to push it through before the next federal election.
Thanks, Sherry. Anyone else want to comment on that one or feel like that was enough?
Yeah, just really quickly, one other point that I think we've been trying on specifically on advanced requests to convey is we don't want to characterize it as an expansion of MAID. We want to characterize it as a change to the nature of consent. So consent being written in advance, prior consent, freely given, non-coerced. And I think if you put those kind of safeguards front and center and you say, we're not looking to vastly expand the numbers of people, we're just looking to give Canadians a reasonable choice if they're suffering. And I think put in that kind of sense, I think you might get a better response.
Thanks, Chris. We've got a couple people asking for an update on MAID for those with a mental illness as a sole underlying medical condition and when that will become legal. So I'll maybe just give that one. So currently, because of the last extension that the government put forward in bill, I think it was C62, the next deadline is March of 2027, so another 2.5 years at this point. For anyone who missed the news, we are part of a legal challenge that's been filed in the province of Ontario to try and get that legislation moving faster. So Dying Dignity Canada, on behalf of the public, along with two individual plaintiffs, John Scully and Claire Elise Brosso, have filed a legal challenge to that. So we hope to see some change sooner than 2027, but I think, as all of you know, lawsuits do take some time, so we'll keep you updated, but that likely won't move. It'll be months before much happens. Okay, other questions. So here's an interesting one. Assuming we'll be heading into a federal election soon, do we have a general sense as to how each of the three political parties will respond to our request to move advanced requests forward? If someone wants to speak to that a bit, and then if they can, you can also speak a bit to what we would do in a federal election, or a couple of us can answer that question. Does somebody want to start on that one?
Sure, I could maybe just quickly. I think that unlike mental illness, where there were some pretty strong blocks of opinion in the parties, I think advanced requests is more individual oriented here, and I think there's a pretty strong predisposition that it's a good thing on the part of many backbench Liberal MPs, likewise with many NDP MPs. Certainly the Bloc Québécois MPs are overwhelmingly in favor of it. I think what we don't know yet is where some Conservative MPs will land on that issue. So I think that it kind of varies a little bit, but it's encouraging.
And Sherry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that only the Bloc wants something to happen now before the next election, and all the other parties are focused on other priorities. And I'm sorry, I sound a little doom and gloom about this. We have to keep pushing. But I agree with everything Chris said. But also don't forget that during a campaign, you go to those all candidates meetings and try to get your questions on advance requests put to the panel. You usually have to be there ahead of time, submit your question, and hope that it will make it through. And then you'll hear what all the candidates think about it. And you can definitely put, like the majority of Canadians want this, where do you stand on it kind of approach.
Thanks, Sherry. And then maybe just to comment that during the last federal election, Dying with Dignity Canada actually came up with a federal election toolkit specifically for the election. We posted all of the party platform pieces for all parties that were relevant to assisted dying or end of life on our website, and generally made information and this kind of education available to people. So I would anticipate we'll be doing something along the same lines when the next election is called. Okay, thanks for a great presentation. Is it worthwhile to discuss this at the municipal level? Anyone want to take that one?
I would say no, but I just don't see how it ties to any municipal legislation.
Yeah, I would agree. I think where we've done some work municipally, it usually comes down to more things like where there's a policy around health delivery that a region maybe has some control over. I'm trying to remember, I think Grey County, we had a case where we were able to influence some change around a long-term care policy because the long-term care homes were run by the region, but I can't think of anything else. Chris, any other thoughts?
No, not on that particular issue. It's never come up in my experience.
Okay. Okay, who wants to speculate on this one? When will the voting be on Bill C-390?
Well, can I, one thing that we could ask you as attendees on this call to do is when and if you go and see your MP, ask if they would be willing to co-sponsor that bill. So that involves the MP in question filling out a form in his office saying, I agree, I like this bill, I like them, it has merit, and I would like to support it. And they have that capacity to do that. So the more MPs we can get co-sponsoring this bill C-390, the better it'll be, the easier it'll be when we're trying to kind of drum up broader political support. So as to when it'll be, it's very much a function of how much time is allocated to private members' bills, and whether the government whip's office decides to advance a particular bill or not, and that's a little unknowable.
I'd love to add to that. I think that's a great idea, Chris, and I'm going to ask my MP if she will co-sponsor the bill, because that will force the discussion again at the federal level, because they basically down tools, it seems to me. So even though the bill will probably never get passed, we can make it get more attention, both within the House and in the media, if we get more people signing on. That's your thinking, and I think that's brilliant. Yeah, I'll be talking to my MP.
Yeah, and I think, I think I'd like to be slightly more optimistic than that. And I think the more pressure we all collectively put on our own MPs, the better it is. So just a reminder as well, if you haven't sent a letter, I know we're asking you to meet with your MPs, but we also have the letter writing tool on our website, which lets you send a letter to your MP, which also goes to the ministers involved, and currently it's going to the PMO. So I would encourage, that's the Prime Minister's office. So I would encourage you to do that as well as hopefully have a meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, I think this is the last question I have right now. How likely is it that advance requests will be honored in the province of Ontario? And is it possible that substitute decision makers could enforce our wishes? Does anyone want that one in particular? All right, so I will go with, given right now there's no legislation that would support Ontario provincially being able to move ahead with advanced requests, I would say right now that's highly unlikely. If Bill C-390 were to pass, then I think as an organization, we would now be focused on getting the province of Ontario to put together a framework. That might be a bit of a hard sell in Ontario, but that would definitely be our next step. And in terms of substitute decision makers enforcing our wishes, I think we would be looking at, in Quebec, they're calling it a trusted third party, or third person, but it's basically an individual who helps to identify the moment in which the advance request you described is in play. So when you've reached that state that you appear to have described, substitute decision makers would never actually initiate or consent to your made request through an advance request. Does anyone want to add to that?
No, that's great.
Sorry.
Okay, so last call, if you're online and you want to throw a question in the chat, you can do that. In terms of the meeting, so just a reminder, we'd love you to do a meeting or a call. Right now is a great time because the MPs are still in their riding, so that makes them a little more accessible to you, and they're there until I think it's mid-September, the 21st maybe. And then even after that, they have break weeks. So there are weeks when they're in the riding. And if you Google like House of Commons calendar, you can see exactly when that is. Or
They
again,
come back on the
reach out to us.
16th, actually.
Is it the 16th? Okay, so September 16th. So reach out to us. We're happy to support you in whatever way we can in terms of having a meeting, getting your materials together, talking it through a little bit. MPs really are, and MLAs and MPPs, they really are just people like you. I had a meeting with an MP once that was one of the greatest meetings I ever had, and it started with me noticing he had a Hyundai umbrella in his office, and I owned a Hyundai car, and we went from there. So, they really are just people, and they want to hear from the people in their riding. So please reach out to us if we can help you, and thank you so much for being with us. And Sherry just has a final comment.
I want to say that on another matter, about 10 years ago, I went to every MP in the Ottawa area. I think there are about 10 of them. And you can do that too. If you have the time to advocate, as long as you bring a voter, a constituent through the door with you, they will meet. So that's another thing you can do when you're going to meet your elected official. Work with a buddy. It makes it a lot easier, a lot less scary. As Helen says, they want to meet us. You're the voter. But you can go to more than your own MP as long as you have a constituent with you. That's
Great reminder, Sherry. Super. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I want to thank everyone for being with us today. We will send out the recording and the links to the toolkits again to you in the next few days. And if you need us, you know where we are. Thanks, everyone.